His wife is the children's ministry director of the Lithuanian conference, and just speaking with them of the challenges that exist in Lithuania. Lithuania is a secular, it is a postmodern, post-Christian, post-Soviet context, and this is not unique to Lithuania. There's a lot of countries in Eastern Europe that have a similar background, and in a context where God isn't even on the radar. There's no reference point in their minds for a biblical worldview or even a Christian worldview. In fact, specifically in Lithuania originally back in, we're talking about the 1300s, was a pagan country with, witches and warlocks and fairies. And I don't know if you have noticed in the Old Testament, it talks about high places. I don't know if you remember that, where they would do their sacrifices for idols. Well, interesting thing, Lithuania has a lot of high places and where they used to do their things, with the paganism and the spiritualism. And what's interesting is that since the fall of communism, the country is actually kind of returning back to those origins of who they are. They feel it's their heritage. And so this is just an interesting combination of like I said, postmodernism and secularism, but then also spiritualism and paganism and materialism. And the challenges in Lithuania are great. In the entire country, it's a country of 2 million and decreasing is their population, 2 million and decreasing. People are emigrating out of the country. In this country of 2 million and decreasing, there are 635 Adventist members on the books in the entire country. 635 on the books. And then I asked the pastors, I said, and of those 635 that are on the books, how many are attending? And he said, approximately 300 attend, but not regularly. 300, but not regularly. Newport Richey, Aldith, help me out here. I think we have 382 church members here in Newport Richey on the books. Maybe 150, maybe 200 who attend on any given Sabbath. Can you imagine? Our church potentially has as many Adventists as there is in the entire country of Lithuania. The challenges are great, and yet we are still called to the proclamation of the gospel in Lithuania. Now, it's a challenge, and so I spoke about 4 times over there at the churches, and I was trying to encourage them because they're kind of discouraged about evangelism. And so I tried to encourage them when I go over there, but then they come back to me and they ask me, well, how many people are you baptizing? It's a fair question, isn't it? As I'm trying to encourage them over there, they ask me, well, how many people are you baptizing a year? And what are you doing that's working? Tell us, because I sometimes preach theoretical. I enjoy the theoretical. That's kind of my favorite sphere to kind of inhabit is the theoretical, right? But they're asking, no, what are you actually doing tangibly that's working? Can you share that with us? Tell us the nuts and the bolts of what's working. And I think it's a fair question. And so when I go back, maybe next year, I better have some answers for them, don't you think? Some practical answers of what we're doing here in Newport Richey that is working in proclaiming the gospel and winning souls. And also, I'll share some more stories here with you about that here today that got me thinking about that. That's part of Pentecost 2025. I think it's so important for us, Newport Richey, to focus on the proclamation of the gospel in our community. So, today, I want to share with you 2 stories of individuals in Lithuania, conversations that I had with them and their faith journey. And as you hear their stories, as you hear their testimony, I hope that it is encouraging. Now, I have more stories, and like I said, maybe I'll share them next week. I'm not sure. We'll see. But at least 2 stories today of individuals in Lithuania and their faith journey. Are you ready? Story number 1. This is Yuri. Story number 1, Yuri. Yuri is a story in my mind that illustrates the concept of unity, liberty, and charity. There's a saying that says, in essentials, unity. Have you heard that? In non-essentials, liberty. But in all things, charity. Let me talk to you about Yuri. So Yuri attends the church there in Chile, and I'll show you a few pictures of the church. That's where my wife is from. That's her home church there. And Yuri attends the church there in Chile, and he married one of my wife's friends, childhood friends. And so while we were over there, they invited us to the home. And I've known Yuri for a little while. The first time I went to Lithuania was in 2007, and he was there. And just kind of through the years, after that, he married my wife's friend, and then we've kind of gotten to know him a little bit. But this last time, he invited us home for Sabbath lunch, and as we're sitting and we're talking about various things, I say, Yuri, so tell me a little bit about your faith journey. How'd you become an Adventist? How did you become a Christian? Are your parents Christian? Are they Adventist? Tell me about it. And he said, well, no, my mom and dad, they're not Adventists. They're not believers. My older brother, he's not a believer. I am the only one. And when they tell me that, I'm like, that excites me. Well, tell me about that. How did you become a believer? And so Yuri says, well, it began when I was 7 years old. I can't remember exactly what it was, he says, but there was this event at the local Catholic church. I don't know if you know anything about Catholic churches in Europe, but Catholic churches are big in Europe. Catholic churches are they used to be the center of town. They were the largest building in the town. You could see the cathedral or the church from miles and miles outside of the city. That was the center of community life. And so he says, I don't remember exactly what was going on, but I remember I was 7 years old, and there was some type of function in the local Catholic church, and that was the first time I had ever gone into a church. And I remember going into the Catholic church, and I was 7 years old, and I just looked up, and it was just such a large building, and then they had all these sculptures and all these paintings, and my little 7-year-old mind was just taken by all the sculptures. But then there was one sculpture in particular that caught my attention, and that sculpture was of soldiers, Roman soldiers, with their swords and their shields and their spears, and they were leading this man somewhere, and this man was carrying some type of a wooden plank or a wooden beam. Of course, he's expressing he didn't know what this was when he was 7 years old, so he's trying to describe it as best as he can. And that image of these Roman soldiers leading this man with a wooden beam, a wooden cross, it left an impression on my mind. Who is this individual, and what was going on in that scene? 7 years old. This was 1981. 7 years old in 1981. 10 years later, in 1991, now he is 17 years old. Communism has just fallen. And he says that for the very first time, there was this TV program, or broadcasting channels were now open, and all kinds of different programming were being broadcast. And he says, I remember that at 17, there was this movie about Jesus, that it was broadcast. He believes, he says it was broadcast over all the Soviet Union. It was a former Soviet Union. He believes that it was, millions and millions of people watched it for the very first time. And so 10 years later, he's watching this movie, and he recognizes and he remembers, wait a minute, this is that individual that I remember seeing when I was 7 years old in that sculpture in that Catholic church. Who is this individual? He seemed like he was a good person, and it seemed like he was doing good things. A pity that he died. That was sad that they killed him, but that was about all. Who is this person? And now that he had newfound freedom and the ability to search, he started attending different churches, trying to understand what truth was, what was true, what was right. He got involved with the New Age a little bit to see, is there anything there for me or not? During this time, he studies to become an engineer. And so, being an engineer, his mind is quite, logical and calculating, and he wants to understand things, and he's not really understanding things. And then someone says, here, what you need to do is you need to read this. And they hand him a copy of the New Testament. And so he starts reading through the New Testament, the first book in the New Testament, right, the Gospel of Matthew. And so he starts reading it, and towards the end of the Gospel of Matthew, he recognizes, oh, wait a minute, this is the story of that individual who I saw when I was 7 years old on the sculpture, the movie that they just passed. This is his story. Interesting. Then he kept reading, and then the second book in the New Testament, Mark. And he's like, oh, it's the same story again. And then he goes into the third book of the New Testament, and it is the Gospel of Luke, and he's like, oh, the same story again, a third time. And then he keeps reading, and he goes into the fourth book of the New Testament, which is the Gospel of John, and he's like, it's a little different, but it's the same story, and I don't understand it. And he closed his Bible, and he went on from there. He started having other conversations with friends and with colleagues, and then they told him, no. You see, what you need to do is the New Testament is built on the Old Testament. So what you need to do is you need to read the Old Testament. And so they gave him a copy of the Old Testament. And so he opens it up to the first book of the Old Testament. Does anybody know what that is? Genesis. And he starts reading Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. And about there, he doesn't understand a word he's reading, and he just closes it. And he says, I couldn't make sense of any of all this. And he says, I have this thing where if I'm reading a book, and if it doesn't grab my attention, if I don't understand what it's saying, I'll read X number of pages, and then if I don't understand it, I'll just close it, and I'll leave it at that. As Yuri is sharing this with me, it reminds me of a story in the book of Acts, of the Ethiopian eunuch, in Acts chapter 8 and verse 28. And there's the Ethiopian eunuch sitting in his chariot, reading the book of the prophet Isaiah. This is Acts chapter 8 and verse 28. And the Spirit told Philip, go to that chariot and stay near it. And so Philip went up to the chariot and heard the man reading from the prophet Isaiah. And Philip then asks the eunuch, do you understand what you're reading? I think this is very insightful to us because I think sometimes we think that it's just enough to just give a piece of literature, right? I mean, and we need to, right? We need to do that. That's part of it. But maybe there's also more that we should be involved with. And so Philip asks the eunuch, do you understand what you are reading? And the eunuch tells him, how can I understand unless someone explains it to me? It's a very important principle, Newport Richie, for evangelism, for the proclamation of the gospel. And so Yuri is there, and he doesn't understand the New Testament. He doesn't understand the Old Testament. He's just closed it. And then he has a friend at work. And that friend at work has now started attending the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He's also a new believer. And that friend at work, they start talking about different things, and Yuri tells him how he's searching, he's trying to find truth, but he's read the New Testament, doesn't understand it, read the Old Testament, doesn't understand it. And his friend tells him, oh, I've just started to attend this church. They go to church on Saturdays, and we're actually studying a book, and he gives him the book that they're studying. He says, here, take this book, it's going to change your life. And he gives him a copy of, can anyone guess what it is? Oh, no. Wow, but that was pretty unison, though. You guys said it, though. Great controversy. Great controversy. Handed in the book, Great Controversy. And so Yuri says, all right, I've tried the New Testament, didn't work. I've tried the Old Testament, hasn't worked. Here's another big book, The Great Controversy. Let me start reading it. He opens it up, 20 pages in. He closes it and says, I don't understand a word that this is saying. And so then his friend says, Yuri, well, don't give up, Yuri. We have a small group that meets every Friday at someone's home. Why don't you come to that small group meeting? We're studying the book, The Great Controversy. You can meet other people that are young like yourself, and we're all still learning and growing. Yuri, why don't you come to that meeting? And so Yuri starts attending that small group. It is now the late 90s by the time he starts attending that group. And in that small group, as they're studying every Friday, reading through the Great Controversy, doing Bible study, Yuri develops community, develops friendships, develops relationships with the small group. And from that moment on, from the late 90s, he starts attending the church there, the Adventist church. He starts attending it faithfully every Sabbath for 15 years. Amen? Amen. From the late 90s, and I'd say 15 years. I'll tell you about that why here in a little bit. Every Sabbath, he starts attending that church faithfully, attending the small group on Fridays, attending church Sabbath morning. Yuri starts volunteering at his local church. He starts teaching Sabbath school. He starts leading out in outreach. He becomes a leader of that church, except that the first 15 years, he was never baptized. Yuri was just baptized 10 years ago. 2014. And so I asked Yuri, well, you were attending faithfully, you hit all the check marks, right, of what a faithful Seventh-day Adventist is. He was faithful in his tithe and offering as well. And how come you were never baptized for those 15 years? And he said, well, I was interested. He says, I was interested in being baptized, and I would see people being baptized all the time, but no one ever asked me whether or not I wanted to be baptized. Isn't that something? I started thinking of my church here in Newport Richey. Is there someone here today that needs to be asked whether they want to be baptized? Is there someone here that has never been asked whether or not they want to be baptized? Or even furthermore, is there someone here that has been coming and has been attending faithfully, but somehow you need to study more? You need someone to explain the scriptures to you a little bit more, the gospel message a little bit more. So I started thinking about this in my conversation with Yuri, and he says, no one ever asked me. I was interested, but no one ever asked me. But then he said, but then I also kind of had a problem. This is where liberty comes in. I also had kind of a problem with the way they were baptizing people. Because I would notice that every time someone wanted to be baptized, they would stand them up in front of church and they would read this long list of 28 things. Do you believe this? Do you believe that? Do you believe this? Do you believe that? And the person, yes, 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 yes. And he was like, that just kind of, I just didn't connect with that. And I didn't connect with that because when I was reading the Bible, in the New Testament and the Gospels, when people were baptized in the Bible, it was, for the repentance of sins, and do you believe Jesus? And that was it, and they were baptized. What is this whole long list of this, and this? Now, he was doing all those things. He's been attending for 15 years. But he was like, I just didn't connect with that. Just didn't connect with that. And then he said another thing he said that I didn't connect with is as you're asking people, what they believe in this, and that in order to first be baptized. He said, one of the things they would also ask them is if you believe, forgive me, Newport Richey, do you believe in Ellen White? And he said, I had a problem with that. I just, in order to be baptized, in order to be saved, I have to say I believe in Ellen White. Newport Richey, are you hearing me? Are you feeling me? He said another thing that I had a problem with as well was the Trinity. I couldn't get with the Trinity, right? Now, of course, I believe in the Trinity, right? But I'm listening to his story. I'm not gonna go right there and say, oh no, let me break down the Trinity here for you. No, I'm just listening to his story, right? And that's why I believe that his story is a story of unity, liberty, and charity. Because it's interesting, especially when we speak about the Trinity, if we're honest with ourselves, some of our early Adventist pioneers were not Trinitarian. They were anti-Trinitarian. James White, Joseph Bates, Uriah Smith, right? And I think they're all right? I mean, I think James and Uriah and Joseph Bates, I think they're all right? Since then we've adopted the Trinity, I almost am sure that his problem with the Trinity and his problem with Ellen White is probably because no one has ever sat down and explained it to him. I guarantee that's almost the problem. But so finally the pastor asked him 15 years in, and I think the only reason they asked him is because he wanted to marry, my wife's childhood friend, and she was an Adventist, and so, we have to marry, you're not baptized, and so, we got to get you baptized before we marry you. And so he's having these conversations with local leadership, the three problems that he has, the whole long list of baptismal vows, the Trinity and Ellen White, and as they're talking with the leaders, they're like, well, just do it anyways, just say you believe, just raise your hand anyways. And Yuri's a man of integrity, and he's like, no, I can't. If that's how you're going to do it, I can't do this. And they're like, okay, well, we'll figure this out. Maybe there's another pastor in another church that can baptize you, that won't ask you all those things. And he's like, wait a minute, what's that? I mean, another pastor from, wait a minute. Finally, they were able to work it out. I don't know how they worked it out. But they were able to work it out. And Yuri is now a baptized member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And he continues to attend faithfully every Sabbath and participate in the life of the church. And as I listened to his story, remember what did I say? In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. And then I remembered this quote here from Acts chapter 15 and verse 19. And remember, remember his story, coming from a secular background, not having any understanding of God, and yet he makes his way to the Seventh-day Adventist church. And yet when he's at the Seventh-day Adventist church, it seems that we're making it hard for him to become a member of the Seventh-day Adventist church. And this is James in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15 and verse 19. And the Apostle James, he says, don't make it difficult for those who are turning to God. Now that's kind of my paraphrase. The original says, don't make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. You see, what was going on in the New Testament church is that you had the Jewish believers, and then you had the Gentile bbelievers. And as the number of Gentile believers were coming into the church with a new culture, with a new language, with a new way of doing things, and a new way of just different ways of being and their culture and whatnot, and the Jewish believers start being outnumbered, the Jewish believers start saying, no, Gentiles, you have to do this and this and this and this and this if you want to be part of us. And James, in the conclusion, he says, don't make it difficult for people who are coming to God. Newport Richie. There's a process for discipleship. Yes, there's a process for discipleship. And believe me, I believe all 28 fundamental beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I believe it's important that we know these things as well. But when people are coming to God, let's not make it difficult for them. That's Uri. Let's talk about story number 2. This is Maria. Conversation number 2 that I had with in Lithuania. This is Maria. Maria has been, she was born in Lithuania, raised in Lithuania. She was there when I first arrived to Lithuania in 2007, and for some reason, this was the first time that I noticed Maria. Maria is 75 years old. Born in 1949. Maria is the daughter of one of the first Lithuanian families who converted to Adventism in Lithuania. Her grandmother in the 1920s was one of the first converts to Adventism. Her father around that time was about 18 years old, and he became an Adventist pastor. And actually became one of the first Adventist pastors in that city. I'll share a little bit more about that. And then Maria was born in 1949. Maria is part of a family of one of the first Lithuanian families to convert to Adventism in Lithuania. Interestingly enough, which complicated things later, is that the first Adventist missionaries to Lithuania were from the country of Germany. And if you can imagine how that complicated things when World War II breaks out, and the Russians and the Germans, and the Adventist church has been led and mentored by German missionaries, and what that led to, and the understanding of this church. The Adventist church is a church of the fascist West. That was the mindset then at that time. In fact, these are some of the pictures that Maria has of her father, who became a pastor, was a colporteur. The young man that you see there on the bottom right, that was her uncle, her mother's brother. He was 25 years old, and he was killed because he was speaking German in public. And so the Soviets thought that he was a German spy, and so they just went and they shot him. Now, as she's telling me this, I'm like, wait a minute, did they first arrest him? Was there, a process? Did they take him to court? What was it? No, there was no process. They just shot him and they killed him. 25 years old. Maria's father became the first pastor. This is the city of Cholet, where my wife is from, there in Lithuania, where the church is. And Maria's father became the pastor of the church there. Communism comes into the country shortly after the World War II in 1945, 1946 or so. In the 1960s, there is a intensification of persecution in Lithuania in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the Seventh-day Adventist churches close in Lithuania. They're open in Estonia, which is just to the north. They're open in Latvia, which is just to the north. Latvia and Estonia were Protestant countries. Though they were communists, they had a Protestant heritage. Lithuania had a Catholic heritage. And so the Catholic Church conspires with the government in the 1960s to close down all the churches of all those sects. And that's what they call them, all the sects that are out there. Interestingly enough, Catholics conspire with the government, and then government also turns on Catholics later on. But that's how the story goes. Now, and I'm listening to this, I'm like, is this really real? Did this really happen? In the 1960s, the Soviets, the communist government, they employ a 6-day school week. 6-day school week, Monday through Saturday. Monday through Saturday. A 6-day school week. And what's interesting here is that Maria was giving me, she has a list of these articles. Her family, her father being the pastor of the church. The church is now closed. It's the 1960s. Persecution is intensifying. They start pressuring Maria's father, her family, because they were not sending Maria and her older brother, they were not sending them to school on Saturday because they believed the seventh day is the Sabbath. And Maria actually gave articles to me. She's documented this. I was like, is this real? And she's like, yeah, here are all the articles that we saved back from. The first article was written in 1959. It wasn't just one time period. It was several years that they started putting pressure on the family because they're not sending their children to school. Here's an article right here that they wrote, and it is entitled Verbisky's. That was her maiden last name. This article is entitled Adventistas. Can you kind of get what that means? Adventist Verbisky's, who's the pastor of Cholet, Adventist Verbisky's has a black conscience. Isn't that interesting? And that was the article that was published there. The article goes on to say, and this is as the persecution is intensifying. The article goes on to say, all of Vytautas' friends, that's Vytautas is Maria's older brother. Lithuanian names are strange, especially the guy names are strange. So Vytautas is his name, his older brother. Here, let me show you a picture. That's them. That's Maria and her older brother, all right, Vytautas there. He was about 11 in that picture. She was about 8 in that picture. As things are intensifying, it says, all of Vytautas' friends, this is the article that was written, 1959. All of Vytautas' friends have bought their books for 6th grade, except for poor little Vytautas, who's repeating 5th grade. And he's repeating 5th grade because his father, a self-proclaimed, in quotation, servant of God, does not allow him to go to school on Saturdays. Right? Verbiscus is the father's last name. Verbiscus says, he's my son, and I do whatever I want with him. Quotation marks. Supposedly. Verbiscus, the article says, is hiding under the pretext of freedom of conscience, but the truth is that Verbiscus himself has already lost his conscience. Verbiscus, knowing that it is harder to influence and convince adults, is now targeting children, starting with his own children and deceiving the teenagers living in his neighborhood. Now, as I'm reading this, I'm like, man, this is an intense piece. I mean, do you see the language that's being used? This is very biased, very negatively slanted, incendiary language. I mean, if I read an article and it says this gentleman is targeting children, I mean, immediately what's going on in your mind? Wait a minute, what's going on? Who's this? What's this dude doing? I mean, what's going on? All right. The reality is that what he was doing was holding after-school Bible studies for the children in the neighborhood, something like VBSs. That's kind of what he was doing. But the way this article is spinning it is he's now targeting children. He's an Adventist, a self-proclaimed spreader of God's word, God's servant. This is the article. I mean, this is stuff like out of a tabloid, but that's how it was written. He shares the teachings of this religious sect of Adventisms. In public, he carries his hands piously over his chest. However, his behavior with his son at home is altogether of a different character. He may not threaten his son with the fear of Satan and hellfire, but what Verbiscus does is he makes hell at home for his son. Whether he wants it or not, his son Vytautas doesn't have any choice but to do what his dad demands of him. Verbiscus doesn't let his children go out with friends on Saturday. Verbiscus doesn't allow his children to go to the cinema. Verbiscus doesn't allow his children to read literature on Sabbath or play sports on Saturday. Activities that are perfectly healthy and normal for children their age, Verbiscus is isolating them from their friends. He's forcing his minor children to believe in his religion. Now, don't get me wrong, everyone has religious freedom, but it's against the law to force your beliefs on others. And in fact, it's criminal, really, what he's doing to his children. No upright, honest, upstanding citizen can keep quiet about what he's doing. What do you think about that? The pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the city, this article goes out like this about him to the public. This is 1959. In 1961, they decide to hold a trial in the city to decide whether Maria's father, whether they could keep parental rights or whether the state should take the children away from him because he's a Seventh-day Adventist and doesn't send his children to school on Saturday, Sabbath. And so in 1961, they hold a public trial. They called it in the People's Court. They held it in the local theater there in the city of Cholet. In fact, that theater is still there. And so they hold it in the theater. As she's telling me the story, I'm like, why did they hold the court hearing in the theater? And she says it's because they wanted to make a public spectacle of everyone. And so they invited the whole city. It fits upwards, a theater fits upwards of 300 people. All the city officials, this is really a kangaroo court is what's going on here. All the city officials were there. It was packed, she said, and they have the hearing. And in it, they argued that Verbiscus, this is again the pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist Church there in Cholet, they were arguing, the prosecution was arguing that he needed to lose his parental rights because of his negligence in providing for the welfare of his children. You know, people are the citizens, they're there, they're listening to this, they're like, oh, what is this guy doing? And so they ask him there in the court, what is the basis for you, Verbiscus, to keep your children from receiving a proper education? And then Pastor Verbiscus, he replied, and he said, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, it says, remember the seventh day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall work. And he recites the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment to them. Their response was, that's fine for you to believe, but you can't force that on your children. I mean, his kids are, at this time they're about 11 and 13 years old, Maria and Vytautas. And as she's telling me this, they're holding this in the theater. She's telling me the story, I think about this passage here in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 9. The Apostle Paul says, we have been made a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. And I highlighted the word there, spectacle, in red because in the Greek, the word spectacle is theatros, where we get the word theater from. It also reminded me of Matthew chapter 10, verses 17 through 20. Jesus says, on my account you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses. But do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time you will be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. They said, that's fine for you to believe, but you can't force that on your children. We have tried to reason with you, Verbiscus. We have tried to reason with you. We have tried to work with you, but you are obstinate, you are recalcitrant, and you are uncooperative. And so they removed custody of their children from. They took Maria and her older brother Vytautas. They forcibly removed the children from them. They took the children away from them. and then they sent them to a boarding school about 2 to 3 hours away. During this time, and they were away for 5 years, and so if you can imagine, Maria at that time was 11 years old, and they were away from their home for 5 years. For the first 3 years, the parents were unable to visit them or have any communication with them. Maria and Vytautas, then she told me, well, okay, now you're in a boarding school, now you're not around your parents, now you're in this place. And she says, so what would you do now? And she says, well, it was still a 6-day school week that we had to go to on Saturdays. And so I was like, well, so what did you do? And she's like, well, I would just stay in my room on Saturdays. I wouldn't go to school. And so then the school officials would come and they would forcibly, take me by the hand or, drag me into the classroom. And once I was in the classroom, then I would lay my head on the desk all day long until school was over. And so I'm listening to this. Her brother Vytautas would do the same thing. And one day, instead of taking him forcibly to the classroom, they threw him outside. It was wintertime. It was snowing. They threw him outside. And then they called the psych ward or something like that to come pick up this child who was crazy. And so the nurses or whatever from the psych ward, they came, they picked up Vytautas, they took him to the psychiatric ward, they did an analysis on him. Is this kid crazy or is this kid not crazy? What's actually going on? I mean, can you imagine? I mean, he's 13 years old. The doctor, though it wasn't all bad, the doctor who did the evaluation said he's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong. In fact, it's probably the school director who needs to be put into the psych ward for doing this, to a 13-year-old. But this would go on for 5 years. Let me see here. In fact, she lost a school year also because of this. Vytautas was older, so he graduated earlier. But then shortly after he graduated, he was 17, 18. Now he had to do military service. And it happened all over again. In fact, Vytautas, he died in his early 40s of a heart attack. There was an article that was written about Vytautas in 1991, 1992. I have the article with me. A freelance journalist, finds out about their story and starts researching their story. And one of the things the journalist writes in 1991 is he says, I wonder if Vytautas wouldn't still be alive today if not for everything that he suffered when he was a child. So at the age of 16, 5 years later, Maria is now 16 years old, and she's able to return home. She went in like this. She came out like this. 5 years. And as I'm listening to this story, Newport Richie, from Maria, we sat in her living room, and she was telling me this, and I'm thinking, there must have been a way, Maria. Now we're doing this through translation, right? My wife is translating. I'm not speaking directly to Maria, but we're doing this through translation. My wife is translating, and I'm thinking, Maria, I didn't tell this to her, but in my mind, I'm thinking, no, there must have been a way, Maria, for this spectacle to be avoided. There must have been a way. Maybe we could have done some damage control here. Why did it have to get to that point? Surely there could have been some de-escalation that could have been done. Especially considering, forgive me, Newport Richie, especially considering how we keep the Sabbath nowadays. Maybe your dad was a little bit radicalized. Maybe he was a radicalized Adventist pastor. Maybe he was being a little bit too strict. Maybe he was being a little bit too fanatical. Maybe a little bit too extreme. Could it be possible that maybe the article was right? And then I started thinking, what legal precedents are going on during this time? Well, what about the Jews in Lithuania? And their Sabbath exemption. Oh, wait a minute. There were no Jews in Lithuania anymore. Lithuania before World War II was considered the Jerusalem of the North. There was upwards of 210,000 Jews. Within a few months, from June of 1941 to December of 1941, within 6 months, 195,000 Jews were killed in Lithuania. The rest were able to flee. When I went there in 2019, I saw these markers on the side of the road, and these are indeed pictures of Jews in Lithuania during that time, tied up with ropes. And as we were driving in 2019 through the countryside of Lithuania, I saw all these markers, and it said, I can't read Lithuania, but it had the Star of David, and it said something about Holocaust, Judeo, something like that I could kind of figure it out. And I asked my wife, I was like, what is that? What is that marker on the side of the road? And she says, oh yeah, it looks like it's some type of marker. It says a Holocaust grave, something like that. And I was like, oh, well, let's go see if we can, check it out. And so we got off the road, and that road turned into a dirt road, and then that dirt road turned into no road. We were just in the middle of a pasture, and I was like, are we in the right place? What's going on here? And so we backed up all the way to the entrance. There was a house. We're like, hey, we saw this sign. It says something about Judeo's, Holocaust, something. Are we in the right place? And like, oh, yeah. Just keep going. And so we're like, oh, okay, well, we'll keep going. And we're in this pasture, driving in this pasture, and there's cows all around us. And then finally we reach a little wooded area. I don't know if you know where we're going with this. We reach a little wooded area, and there's a stone marker there, and it says there something along the lines of, this was an execution site of mass graves where they would take the Jews in numbers, by the hundreds, by the thousands. They would take them into the woods there that you see there, covered up woods, and they would just execute them and make a mass grave for them there. And I thought that was the only one. But as we traveled all through the country of Lithuania, these would pop up time and time and time again. And so as in my mind, I'm thinking, well, what did the Jews do? What exemptions? Oh, no, there are no Jews in Lithuania during this time. And so then so I start thinking, I'm like, well, once she's removed from her home, and now she's at this boarding school, and she has to go to school now on Saturdays, but she's refusing to attend school, and so they're grabbing her and forcibly taking her to the classroom, and now she's putting her head down all on the desk. I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, okay, I think you've made your point. I think you're actually now becoming a little bit obnoxious. That's what I'm thinking. You're becoming a little bit obnoxious now, Maria. I didn't tell her this, but this is what I'm thinking. You're being uncooperative. I mean, you're being a truant. This is behavior that a problem child would do, right, at school, doing this type of behavior. This is what I'm thinking in my mind. I come back here, I contact some of my colleagues who are in religious liberty. And I contact them, I tell them about the story, and they tell me, this story, it's not an uncommon story. This was a common story in Eastern Germany during communist days. They would be arrested or, even martyred for their faith, or separated. The children were separated. And she told me, Jonathan, you've never lived in a communist country. Communism and socialism for you is a theory, it's an idea, it's a story that you've heard and you've read about. You've never lived in a communist country. You don't know how you or your parents would react under such circumstances. And she says, what's going on here is that as Christians, there's a Bible verse, Acts chapter 5, verse 29. It's a clear mandate for Christians. We have to obey God rather than men. Yes, we try to be the best citizens we can, right, and do everything we can, but if it comes down to being a good citizen or being faithful and obedient to God, the Bible is clear about that. We must obey God rather than man. And the Bible is fairly clear about the seventh-day Sabbath. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. And she says, and while, yes, there are exceptions to Sabbath keeping, medical and doctors and nurses and, things like this, there are exceptions. For the most part, going to school on Sabbath is not what we would consider a Sabbath activity. Am I wrong or am I right? Newport Richie, help me out here. Help me out here. Going to school on Sabbath is not what we view as one of those exceptions. She says, number two, she says the trial. Let's see, what's next? The trial in Cholet there in 1961 at the courthouse, that trial was a test for her parents, whether her parents were going to be faithful to the Sabbath commandment, whether her parents were going to be faithful to God or not. Once the state took the children away, now it was a test for little Maria and Vytautas, whether they as children were going to be faithful to God or not. She said, Jonathan, do you remember the story in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8 where Daniel is taken away from his home, from his family, from his parents, and he's all by himself with his friends, a teenager. In Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8 says, and yet Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. He purposed in his heart that he would remain faithful to God. And so the trial at the theater was a test for her parents. But once the children were taken away and she was in that boarding school, now the test was for little Maria whether or not she would be faithful to God. Yes, to the world this seems like an extreme. It seems like extremism. It seems like fanaticism. But for God, this is what he asks us to do, to be faithful and to obey. Furthermore, she said, number 3, separating parents and children, or the children from their parents, she's told me has actually been a common practice all throughout history with totalitarian regimes, especially even during the Middle Ages and the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, she says. During the days of the Reformation, it were the priests who were targeting the children of Protestant parents. And it was the priests who were trying to create a separation between the children and their parents, trying to instill in the mind of the children that your parents are extremist, that your parents are fanatical, that your parents are being too strict, trying to paint the parents in the worst possible light. And she said this is the same tactics that were being used in the days of communists, and she says it's the same tactics that are even being used today. And number 4, she said, yes, Jonathan, the state does have the right to intervene in families if it has to, but the expectation is that the state's intervention will be less harmful than the problem they're trying to fix. Does that make sense? We're hoping that the cure is not worse than the disease. And so in this sense, the harm caused by separating the children is greater than the harm caused by the children missing school one day a week. And Maria had the full right to protest that, putting her head down, not going to school. I mean, that was a little bit of freedom she still had, and she had the full right to exercise that. And so as my conversation with Maria ended, I asked her at the end, I said, Maria, like I said, she's 75, she's not that old. My mom's 74. I'm like, this is recent. And I said, Maria, how do you feel about everything that you suffered? Was it worth it, Maria? There's a Bible passage. Turn with me in your Bibles to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 9. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 9. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 9. Let me know when you have it there. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 9. Maria, was this worth it? Was it worth it, or was it all for naught, what you suffered? Revelation chapter 2, verse 9 through 10. Jesus speaking to the church of Smyrna, he says, I know your afflictions and your poverty and your tribulation and your troubles, and yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but they are of the synagogue of Satan. In other words, I know how you are being slandered. Verse 10, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown.